They walked past the treasures every day, never knowing what hung beneath their boots. As Nazi jackboots echoed through Prague Castle's ancient corridors, Jewish religious artifacts worth millions remained hidden in plain sight. Under the very noses of Hitler's elite, a small band of Czech curators staged the greatest cultural resistance of World War II. Using secret compartments, false walls, and underground chambers, they preserved centuries of Jewish heritage while death camps blazed across Europe. The officers who used ancient Torah scrolls as tablecloths never realized they were dining atop their own failure. Welcome to the Stellar Archives. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. It helps us bring the truth to light with respect and care. Respect and care. The spring morning of March 15, 1939, brought an unnatural quiet to Prague. Shopkeepers opened their businesses with little conversation. Mothers held their children closer. The medieval streets, normally filled with the sounds of commerce and life, seemed to hold their collective breath. Prague Castle, Pražský hrad, stood as it had for a millennium, perched high above the Vltava River like a stone sentinel watching over the city. Inside its ancient walls, Josef Polák stared through leaded glass windows as columns of German troops crossed the Charles Bridge. The museum curator's hands trembled slightly as he placed them against the cold stone windowsill. "They are actually coming," he whispered to himself, though he had known for months this day would arrive. 6 months earlier, representatives from Britain, France, Italy, and Germany had gathered in Munich to decide Czechoslovakia's fate without a single Czech present. The Munich Agreement handed the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia's borderlands and primary defense, to Hitler's Germany. Now, with the nation's defenses compromised, the remainder of the country lay exposed to Hitler's ambitions. Dr. Polák was Jewish, as were many of his colleagues at the Central Jewish Museum. As curator of decorative arts, he oversaw thousands of priceless objects spanning centuries of Jewish life in Prague. Torah scrolls, silver ceremonial objects, ancient texts, textiles embroidered with gold thread, and handcrafted items dating back half a millennium. In the months following the Munich betrayal, Polák and his fellow curators had watched in horror as anti-Jewish legislation crept across what remained of Czechoslovakia. New laws restricted Jewish movement, employment, property ownership, and access to public spaces. The writing was on the wall long before the troops marched in. Even before occupation became official, Polák and his director, Dr. Hanna Volavkova, had begun making quiet preparations. They had seen what happened in Germany after 1933, the confiscation of cultural artifacts, the systematic stripping of Jewish heritage, the attempt to erase centuries of Jewish contributions to European culture. "We must create a contingency," Volavkova had whispered during an after-hours meeting in December 1938. "We will not allow what happened in Berlin to happen here." That afternoon, as the German army secured key positions throughout Prague, Polák hurried from the castle down narrow stone staircases toward the Jewish quarter. His mind kept returning to the collection, thousands of items representing the soul of Jewish Prague, all vulnerable to confiscation or destruction. The Jewish quarter, known as Josefov, had stood since medieval times. Despite recent modernization efforts, it retained much of its ancient character. Narrow streets wound between tall, aged buildings that leaned slightly toward one another, as if sharing secrets. The Old New Synagogue, Europe's oldest active synagogue, had stood since 1270, surviving fires, pogroms, and attempts at urban renewal. Polák slipped into the Jewish town hall, where several community leaders had gathered. The atmosphere was tense, each face drawn with worry. "What news from the castle?" asked Rabbi Jacob Altman, his normally commanding voice reduced to a whisper. "They have begun establishing offices in the administrative wing," Polák replied. "Military officers are surveying the royal apartments. They move with the confidence of men who have rehearsed this occupation many times before." Silence fell across the room until František Weidmann, the elderly keeper of the Old New Synagogue's keys, spoke. "They will come," for our treasures. It is what they always do." Nods of agreement passed through the gathering. "Then we must not make it easy for them," said Volavkova, who had arrived moments after Polak. She placed a leather portfolio on the table. "I have prepared documents, protection schemes." Polak recognized her strategy immediately. During the preceding months, Volavkova had developed a peculiar and daring plan. Rather than attempting to smuggle artifacts out of the country, a near impossibility given closed borders and increased scrutiny, she proposed something far more audacious, hiding the treasures in plain sight by creating a Jewish museum under the very authority of the occupation forces. "They want to control everything Jewish," she explained. "So we will propose a central repository, a museum of an extinct race, that appeals to their sick anthropological curiosities while actually preserving our heritage." The idea was met with silence, then tentative agreement. It was a dangerous gamble, but perhaps the only viable option. Within weeks, the occupation authority established the Central Office for Jewish Emigration, headed by Adolf Eichmann, to manage the Jewish question in Prague. Among its first actions was the dissolution of most Jewish organizations and confiscation of community assets. Yet strangely, when Volavkova cautiously proposed her museum concept, presenting it as a way to document the former Jewish presence in Bohemia, the proposal received unexpected approval. The Nazi fascination with creating museums of extinct races played directly into Volavkova's hands. What the Germans didn't realize was that they had just authorized the most extensive Jewish cultural preservation effort in occupied Europe. By summer 1939, Jewish religious items from outlying communities began arriving at the Jewish Museum's warehouse. As synagogues across Bohemia and Moravia were closed, their Torah scrolls, silver ornaments, textiles, and books were transported to Prague, not to be destroyed, but preserved by Volavkova's team, who meticulously catalogued each item. What truly set Prague's preservation effort apart was its audacity. While museum staff openly catalogued thousands of items under Nazi supervision, a shadow operation took place after hours. Polak and a select group of trusted colleagues identified the most historically significant and irreplaceable pieces for special protection. In September 1939, as Hitler's forces stormed across Poland, Polak led a midnight expedition deep into Prague Castle's forgotten spaces. Centuries of construction and renovation had created a labyrinth of sealed rooms, false walls, and hidden chambers unknown even to most castle staff. "Here," whispered Miroslav Karny, a young historian who had mapped the castle's secret spaces. He pressed against a seemingly solid wall panel in an unused storage room, revealing a narrow passage. "This connects to a chamber that hasn't appeared on castle plans since 1784. By candlelight, Polak and 3 assistants carried wooden crates containing the most precious scrolls and manuscripts into a dust-filled chamber. The room was bone-dry despite its age, perfect for preserving delicate parchments. "No German will think to look here," Karny said. "They believe they know every corner of the castle, but Prague has kept secrets for 1,000 years." Throughout the fall, the team established more hiding places, beneath floorboards in administrative offices, inside hollow decorative columns, behind false walls in storage rooms, and in sealed medieval chambers accessible only through crawl spaces. Most ingeniously, some artifacts were hidden directly within the castle's public museum collection, mislabeled as Christian or secular items of minor importance. By December 1939, when freshly appointed Reichsprotector Konstantin von Neurath established his headquarters in Prague Castle, hundreds of irreplaceable Jewish treasures were already concealed within its walls. German officers strutted through corridors, never suspecting that the heritage they sought to eradicate surrounded them daily. The irony was not lost on Polak when von Neurath chose the Renaissance Hall, directly above one of their largest hiding places, for his personal office. Each day, the Nazi official sat at his desk issuing orders for the persecution of Jews, while beneath his feet lay centuries of Jewish intellectual and spiritual achievement, silently defying his every proclamation. As 1940 arrived, Prague's Jewish community faced escalating persecution. New regulations restricted movement, imposed curfews, and required the wearing of yellow stars. Deportations loomed on the horizon. For Polak and his colleagues, the preservation work took on increasing urgency as their own futures grew uncertain. "We may not survive this," Volavkova told her staff during a quiet gathering in January 1940. "But what we protect now will testify that we were here, that we created beauty, that we contributed to human knowledge. Even if they take our lives, they cannot erase our history if these treasures survive." None of them could know then just how prophetic her words would be, nor the extraordinary lengths they would soon go to ensure that Prague Castle, the very headquarters of Nazi power in Bohemia, would become the unlikely guardian of Jewish memory. By mid-1941, the character of the occupation had transformed from administrative control to something far more sinister. The appointment of Reinhard Heydrich as Deputy Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia in September marked a turning point. Known as the Hangman and the Butcher of Prague, Heydrich arrived with clear orders from Hitler to crush Czech resistance and accelerate the implementation of the final solution. Within weeks of his arrival, Heydrich summoned the directors of all Prague museums to the castle. Josef Polak managed to avoid the meeting through a strategic illness, sending a junior colleague in his place. That evening, the young assistant returned ashen-faced to their secret meeting place in the basement of a bookbinder's shop. "Heydrich has ordered a complete inventory of all Jewish cultural property," he reported. "Every synagogue, every collection, every private holding. They want a catalog of every ritual object, manuscript, and artwork." Hanna Volavkova closed her eyes briefly. So it begins. What the Nazi leadership intended as an act of cultural plunder, the museum staff transformed into an unprecedented preservation effort. Under the guise of complying with inventory orders, Volavkova's team gained official permission to collect Jewish ceremonial objects from across the protectorate. Synagogues emptied by deportations surrendered their treasures not to the melting pot, but to careful hands that documented each piece with extraordinary precision. The Central Jewish Museum, now operating under direct Nazi oversight, processed over 100,000 items between 1942 and 1944. The official German narrative presented this as preserving artifacts of a vanished race for scientific study. Behind this facade, Volavkova and her colleagues worked with methodical determination to ensure each object was properly identified, photographed, and linked to its community of origin. For items destined for the castle's secret chambers, they developed an ingenious system of documentation. Each hidden piece received a duplicate catalog entry with subtle code markers indicating its true location. Should they survive the war, these records would allow future generations to recover the hidden treasures. The logistics of hiding objects within Prague Castle grew increasingly complicated as the Nazi presence expanded. By early 1942, over 500 German officials and their support staff worked in the castle complex. Areas once accessible to the museum staff became restricted zones. Security checks grew more frequent. Yet the nature of the castle itself provided unexpected advantages. The massive complex, one of the largest in Europe, contained nearly 800 rooms spread across multiple palaces, churches, and halls built over 10 centuries. Heydrich and his senior staff occupied only a fraction of this space, primarily in the representative areas and administrative buildings. The oldest sections, particularly forgotten medieval chambers and sealed passages from the 12th and 13th centuries, remained largely unexplored by the occupiers. Germans, surprisingly superstitious about certain parts of the castle, rumored to be haunted, avoided these areas altogether. František Steiner, an elderly maintenance worker whose family had served the castle for generations, proved invaluable to the preservation effort. His knowledge of hidden passageways, sealed chambers, and forgotten rooms surpassed any architectural plans. In March 1942, he revealed perhaps the most secure hiding place of all, a sealed chamber beneath St. Vitus Cathedral that had been walled off during 16th-century renovations. "My grandfather showed me the entrance when I was a boy," he explained, leading Pollack through a maintenance tunnel below the cathedral's north transept. The chamber was part of the original Romanesque church. When they built the Gothic cathedral over it, this space was forgotten. The room, approximately 15 feet square with a vaulted stone ceiling, was bone dry and had remained sealed for centuries. The air preservation qualities were ideal for parchment and textiles. Here, Pollack and his team concealed the most irreplaceable treasures. Torah scrolls from the 14th century, illuminated manuscripts from medieval Prague, and ritual objects of extraordinary historical significance. The greatest challenge wasn't finding hiding places, but moving items into them unseen. The team developed elaborate schemes involving maintenance activities as cover. Artifacts were carefully packed in tool bags, cleaning supply crates, and even hollow decorative elements being restored by craftsmen. While the preservation work continued in secret, the Jewish community of Prague faced escalating persecution. The establishment of Theresienstadt concentration camp in late 1941 marked the beginning of systematic deportations. Among the first transported were Jewish scholars, rabbis, and community leaders, those who carried cultural memory in their minds. In a cruel twist of fate, the Nazis unwittingly assisted the preservation effort through their obsession with documenting the culture they sought to destroy. In 1942, Hitler approved the creation of the Museum of the Extinct Race in Prague, allocating resources for the collection and documentation of Jewish cultural objects from across occupied territories. Volavkova, now operating with severely reduced staff as colleagues were deported, managed to position herself and remaining team members as essential experts in cataloging these materials. The Nazis, lacking experts in Hebrew and Jewish ritual objects, reluctantly relied on Jewish staff to identify and catalog items. This provided perfect cover for the secret preservation effort. The most audacious aspect of the operation occurred directly under Heydrich's nose. When the Deputy Reich Protector decided to renovate his personal office in the castle's new royal palace in April 1942, the construction created an unexpected opportunity. As workers removed wood paneling to update electrical wiring, Pollack's team, with the silent cooperation of Czech laborers, created a hidden compartment behind the new wall. Into this space went a collection of 16th-century Torah ornaments of silver and gold, alongside irreplaceable manuscripts. For the next 3 years, Heydrich and later his successors would sit mere inches from these treasures while signing deportation orders for the remaining Jews of Prague. On May 27, 1942, Czech resistance fighters carried out Operation Anthropoid, fatally wounding Heydrich in an ambush. His death 8 days later triggered brutal reprisals, including the complete destruction of the villages of Lidice and Ležáky. The Nazi grip on Prague intensified further under his replacement, Kurt Daluege. Throughout this period of terror, the museum staff continued their preservation efforts, even as their own numbers diminished through deportations. By late 1942, Volavkova was among the few original staff members remaining. Pollack received deportation orders in October and disappeared into the machinery of the final solution. Before his deportation, Pollack entrusted critical information about the hiding places to Volavkova and 2 Czech castle employees who had assisted the operation. "If none of us survive," he told them during their final meeting in the basement of the Jewish town hall, "at least leave some indication for those who come after that these treasures exist. The Nazis must not have the final word on our culture." What Pollack and his colleagues could not have anticipated was that the Nazis themselves would soon develop a perverse interest in preserving certain aspects of Jewish culture, not out of respect, but as a trophy of their anticipated victory. This twisted ambition would create both new dangers and unexpected opportunities for the remaining members of the preservation team as the war entered its final, desperate phase. By the bitter winter of 1943, Prague had become a shadow of itself. The once vibrant Jewish quarter stood nearly empty, its inhabitants deported to Theresienstadt and beyond. The streets surrounding Prague Castle, normally bustling with tourists and locals alike, were now patrolled by SS guards who enforced strict curfews and identification checks. Inside the castle complex, the Nazi occupation had transformed the ancient seat of Bohemian kings into a machine of bureaucratic terror. SS General Karl Hermann Frank had established his headquarters in the most prestigious sections of the castle, converting historic halls into offices where deportation orders, execution lists, and policies of Germanization were drafted with cold efficiency. Hanna Volavkova, now one of only 4 Jewish museum staff members remaining in Prague, lived under constant fear of deportation. Her professional expertise had temporarily spared her from transport, as Nazi officials still needed specialists who could identify and catalog Jewish cultural artifacts pouring in from across occupied Europe. "They need us to organize what they steal," she confided to Thomas Kraus, one of the Czech maintenance workers who had secretly assisted the preservation effort. "The irony is almost unbearable." The situation had grown increasingly precarious as the Nazi leadership in Prague evolved their plans for Jewish cultural property. By 1943, Heinrich Himmler had taken personal interest in creating an extensive research library of Jewish materials, not for preservation, but for studying the enemy they sought to eliminate. This project, intertwined with the pseudoscientific racial theories of the Reich, required the collection and organization of Jewish cultural and religious items from across Europe. Under these conditions, the remaining museum staff worked a dangerous double game. Officially, they cataloged items for the Nazi research collection. Secretly, they continued moving the most significant pieces into hiding and creating duplicate documentation that would allow future generations to identify what had been preserved. The mechanics of this deception required extraordinary care. Each morning, Volavkova would receive new shipments of confiscated items at the official museum warehouse in the Pinkas Synagogue. Working under the supervision of German officers, she and her remaining colleagues would catalog these items according to Nazi specifications. The officers, typically unable to read Hebrew or identify the significance of many religious objects, relied heavily on the Jewish experts to explain what they were processing. This dependency created narrow windows of opportunity. When certain SS officers took their lunch breaks or attended meetings at the castle, the museum staff could temporarily substitute items of lesser significance for masterpieces, which would then be prepared for hiding. The Czech maintenance staff at the castle, part of the silent resistance network, provided crucial assistance in these moments. František Novak, a plumber who regularly serviced the castle's aging infrastructure, became an unlikely hero in this cultural resistance. His work orders allowed him legitimate access to restricted areas, including the private quarters of high-ranking Nazi officials. Using a specially designed plumber's case with hidden compartments, he transported small but precious items into the castle, where they would be concealed during routine maintenance work. "I fixed their leaking pipes," he once quipped quietly to Volavkova, "and they never notice what else I carry." The hiding places throughout the castle complex multiplied as the occupation continued. The team favored locations that Germans avoided or rarely inspected: sealed medieval chambers with reputed hauntings, spaces between double walls created during various renovation periods, cavities beneath stone flooring, and compartments inside large decorative features like columns and statues. One of the most ingenious hiding places was developed in late 1943 when General Frank ordered renovations to the castle's ancient heating system. The medieval castle utilized an extensive network of hypocaust heating channels beneath the floors, a Roman-inspired system of hollow spaces through which hot air circulated. Many of these channels had been sealed off when modern heating was installed decades earlier. When German engineers ordered an inspection of these channels to determine if they could be repurposed, Volavkova persuaded them that Jewish workers should handle the dirty exploration work. This created the perfect opportunity to access a network of narrow tunnels running beneath the main administrative areas of the castle. Tunnels the Germans subsequently deemed unusable and forgot about.
Into these spaces went some of the most valuable manuscripts from the Prague Jewish community, including rare 13th century commentaries on the Talmud and irreplaceable records of the community's history dating back to medieval times. The spring of 1944 brought new terror to Prague as the deportations accelerated. The Nazis, facing mounting losses on the Eastern Front, intensified efforts to complete the final solution before military defeat. On May 15th, Volavkova received her deportation notice to Theresienstadt. The night before her departure, she met with her remaining Czech allies in the castle maintenance staff. In the basement workshop where František stored his tools, she passed them a sealed envelope. "This contains the location codes for everything we've hidden," she explained. "Memorize what you can, then destroy it. If any of us survive, we will need to find these treasures again." The next day, she joined a transport of 1,500 Jews to Theresienstadt. Before boarding the train, she managed to pass a final note to Thomas. "Remember, the Germans are fastidious record keepers. When they lose this war, their own documents will help us reclaim what is ours." With Volavkova's deportation, the organized preservation effort lost its primary coordinator. However, the network of Czech castle employees continued their quiet resistance. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1944, as Allied bombs fell increasingly closer to Prague, the Nazi administration began preparing for a potential retreat. Orders came to pack certain collections for transport to Germany, including selected items from the Jewish Museum collection. This created both crisis and opportunity. The crisis lay in preventing irreplaceable treasures from being shipped to Germany, where they might be destroyed in bombing raids or lost forever. The opportunity came in the confusion of packing and inventory, which allowed the Czech resistance members to substitute replicas or items of lesser value in some crates bound for Germany. The most daring operation occurred in September 1944, when SS officers ordered the packing of ceremonial silver items for transport to a secure location in Bavaria. František, now working as a carpenter making shipping crates, created false bottoms in several boxes. The genuine silver ritual objects were hidden in the castle, while similar-looking but less valuable pieces were packaged for transport. By late 1944, as Soviet forces pushed toward Prague from the east, the atmosphere in the castle changed dramatically. German officials began burning documents, packing personal belongings, and preparing for eventual retreat. The castle staff noticed increased nervousness among the officers, who now spent more time securing their potential escape routes than administering the occupied territory. In December 1944, a particularly cold and harsh winter descended on Prague. Fuel shortages left much of the castle unheated except for the areas occupied by senior Nazi leadership. The cold provided perfect preservation conditions for the hidden artifacts, but made the work of the resistance network increasingly difficult as they navigated frigid hidden passages and worked with numbed hands. On Christmas Eve 1944, as German officers celebrated in the heated main hall with imported wine and food requisitioned from Czech farmers, František and 3 other maintenance workers used the distraction to access one of the deepest hiding places, a forgotten crypt beneath the castle chapel. There they secured what many considered the crown jewel of Prague's Jewish heritage, the oldest complete Torah scroll in Bohemia dating to 1347. As they sealed the hidden chamber, sealing it with mortar that would make it appear undisturbed for centuries if necessary, František whispered words that captured their shared hope. "After this long night, someone will search for these treasures by the light of freedom." None of them could know then how soon that light would come, nor how complicated the recovery would prove in the chaos of liberation. The spring of 1945 arrived in Prague with an atmosphere of impending collapse. As Soviet forces advanced from the east and American troops from the west, the Nazi administration in Prague Castle began systematic preparations for retreat. Officers burned documents in courtyard bonfires, packed artwork and valuables looted from Czech collections, and prepared explosive charges for key infrastructure. Karl Hermann Frank, the senior SS official in the Protectorate, issued orders to defend Prague as a fortress city. Yet behind the public pronouncements of resistance to the last man, the Nazi leadership was quietly arranging their own escape routes. German military families had already been evacuated westward, hoping to reach areas that would fall under American rather than Soviet control. Within Prague Castle, the atmosphere grew increasingly chaotic. Guards who had once meticulously checked every identification paper now focused on personal survival. This loosening of security created crucial opportunities for the Czech resistance network that had protected the hidden Jewish treasures throughout the occupation. František Novák, still employed as a castle maintenance worker, used this confusion to access areas that had been restricted for years. Under the pretense of checking water pipes before German departure, he verified that several key hiding places remained undisturbed. What he discovered both relieved and troubled him. The treasures remained hidden. But humidity in one chamber threatened to damage priceless parchments if they weren't recovered soon. On May 5, 1945, as news of Hitler's death spread through the city, the Prague uprising erupted. Czech resistance fighters emerged from underground to confront the remaining German forces. Barricades appeared on major streets, and the red, white, and blue Czech flag, forbidden during the occupation, flew once again from windows and balconies. Inside the castle, German commanders ordered a defensive position. Strategic points were fortified, and machine gun nests established at key entrances. The courtyard that had seen a millennium of Bohemian history became a military staging area as the Germans prepared for a siege. František and several other Czech employees were ordered to remain inside to maintain essential services. This unexpected development placed them in the perfect position to protect the hidden treasures during the chaotic final days of occupation. If they decide to destroy the castle rather than surrender it, everything we've preserved will be lost, František warned his resistance colleagues during a hasty meeting in a basement storeroom. We need to move what we can to deeper chambers below the bedrock level. For 3 days, as fighting raged through Prague's streets, the small team worked during nighttime hours to relocate the most vulnerable treasures to a medieval crypt beneath St. Vitus Cathedral, a chamber so deep that even direct artillery hits on the castle would likely leave it intact. On May 8th, as celebrations of Germany's surrender erupted across Europe, the SS garrison at Prague Castle continued to hold out. Karl Hermann Frank, negotiating for safe passage westward, promised to surrender the castle intact if his forces were allowed to retreat toward American lines. Czech resistance leaders, concerned about potential destruction of the national landmark, reluctantly agreed. Before dawn on May 9th, the last German troops departed Prague Castle. As the morning sun illuminated the ancient walls, Czech partisans cautiously entered the complex, fearing booby traps or a double cross. They found empty offices, abandoned equipment, and evidence of hasty departure. But the historic structure itself remained largely undamaged. For František and his colleagues, the departure of the Germans didn't end their vigilance. The chaos of liberation brought new threats to the hidden treasures. Soviet troops, now entering the city as liberators, conducted their own searches through the castle, looking for hidden Nazi documents, weapons caches, and valuables. In this confusion, the small preservation team maintained their silence about the hidden chambers, waiting for the proper authorities to be established. Their caution proved wise. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, competing factions within the resistance movement and returning government in exile created a fluid power situation. Looting occurred in some government buildings, and the castle itself saw a stream of self-appointed inspectors attempting to claim offices and authority. It wasn't until June 1945 that František felt confident enough to reveal what had been hidden. By then, Czechoslovakia's provisional government had begun re-establishing cultural institutions, including the National Museum and Cultural Heritage Authorities. When František approached Dr. John Květ, a respected art historian appointed to oversee cultural recovery, the preservation story finally emerged. "You need to see what we protected," František told the astonished Květ. "For 6 years, while they occupied our castle, the greatest treasures of Jewish Prague lay beneath their feet. The first official inspection of the hiding places occurred on June 17, 1945. Dr. Květ, doprovázený zástupci obnovené židovské obce a úředníky, následoval Františka skrze skryté chodbě hradu. As they opened the sealed medieval chamber beneath St. Vitus Cathedral, the beam of their lantern revealed stacks of wooden crates carefully arranged against the walls. These have not been touched since 1942, František explained, pointing to the oldest cache. The moisture seals appear intact. When they carefully opened the first crate, the group fell silent. Inside, wrapped in protective linen, lay a 14th-century Torah scroll, its ancient parchment covered with perfectly preserved Hebrew text. Beside it rested silver Torah finials from the old New Synagogue, their delicate craftsmanship untarnished by their years in hiding. Crate after crate revealed similar treasures, prayer books saved from burning synagogues, ritual objects from communities erased by the Holocaust, manuscripts documenting centuries of Jewish thought and culture. Each item represented not just artistic or historical value, but the spiritual legacy of communities that had been decimated. "Where are the people who hid these?" asked Rabbi Gustav Sieker, who had survived the war in Palestine and returned to help rebuild Prague's Jewish community. František's reply captured the tragic reality of the preservation effort. Most were taken. Volavkova to Theresienstadt. Polak, we don't know. Others to Auschwitz. The recovery effort continued throughout the summer of 1945, revealing ever more hidden caches throughout the castle complex. Government photographers documented each location and the removal of items, creating a record of what one official called perhaps the most successful cultural resistance operation of the entire war. As news of the discovery spread, survivors returning from camps came to the temporary Jewish Museum storage facility, hoping to find ritual objects from their destroyed communities. Some found tangible connections to their past: a Torah scroll their grandfather had read from, a ceremonial cup used in their hometown synagogue, embroidered textiles they recognized from childhood. By autumn 1945, a clearer picture of the preservation operation's success emerged. Over 6,000 objects of major cultural and religious significance had been hidden throughout Prague Castle and survived the war intact. Almost 800 Torah scrolls had been preserved, along with thousands of other ritual objects, manuscripts, and artworks. Yet this remarkable preservation stood in stark contrast to the human toll. Of the original team who had conceived and implemented the hiding operation, fewer than a third survived the Holocaust. Hanna Volavkova, against all odds, returned from Theresienstadt in June 1945, emaciated but alive, and immediately resumed her work documenting what had been saved. Josef Polak never returned. In October 1945, when the treasures were officially transferred to the restored Jewish Museum in Prague, the handover ceremony became both a celebration of cultural resistance and a memorial for those lost. František, standing quietly at the back of the room as officials made speeches, perhaps best understood the true achievement. Not just objects had been preserved, but memory itself, the physical evidence that centuries of Jewish life and creativity had flourished in Bohemia before the darkness descended. The castle that had sheltered Nazi power had simultaneously protected what the Nazis most wanted to destroy: the living cultural legacy of the people they had sought to eradicate from human memory.